This is Tony Williams, a senior fellow with the Bill of Rights Institute, and we have our guest here, Peter Myers. And Peter Myers is a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire and a professor at the Ashland University Master's Program for Teachers. He's published a fantastic book. I think it's the best book on Frederick Douglass, titled Frederick Douglass, Race and the Rebirth of American Liberalism. Among many of his scholarly essays, he's written essays on Martin Luther King and is currently at work on an extensive project about the idea of colorblindness in the history of American political thought. Now, he wrote an essay on the Birmingham March and on the Black Power movement of the 1960s for BRI. And for our free online textbook, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, which you can sign up for at billofrightsinstitute.org. The book is a series of components, including narratives, decision points, and scholarly point counterpoints that really bring out the compelling stories and dramas in American history. He's also acting as a scholarly reviewer for the Bill of Rights Institute's curriculum on race relations entitled Liberty and Justice for All. Pete, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Excellent. Well, let's just jump right in. Your essay on the 1963 Birmingham March was really just a model of great narrative writing. And it's really a model for what makes our textbooks so compelling for teachers and students. And can you just give us maybe a little overview, and maybe focus on your writing of it, like what drew you to the story and what makes it such a compelling story?
What drew me to the story was, at the time, I was doing a lot of work on Martin Luther King Jr. You mentioned the book project, the colorblindness book project, and I was going back and forth in my mind about what I wanted that book to be. And for a time, I thought maybe I would focus it more narrowly on MLK, and so I was doing a lot of work on him. More lately, I decided it should have a broader focus. If we look at this as a kind of King-centric story, that Birmingham is the great turning point. That King's fortunes, for reasons we'll get into, are flagging a bit, actually, before Birmingham. And the whole trajectory of King's career changes, or maybe changes again, starts going upward again after Birmingham. He calls it a Third American Revolution. And this is to him the signature moment of it. It is also the moment at which, because of the letter from Birmingham Jail, I think it's the moment at which King makes his greatest contribution to American civil religion. I mean, as moving a speech as the I Have a Dream speech is, I think the letter from Birmingham Jail is the greatest contribution that King makes to our way of thinking about morals and politics. But we can, I think really King in these King as well as events have taught Americans over the last 60 years or so, to think of racism as the deadliest sin, as we see now in American public rhetoric. So that's a generalist way, I guess, of characterizing the significance of Birmingham.
Very interesting, thank you. Yes, and can you provide a little bit of perhaps brief historical background for the events leading up to Birmingham?
Well, as you get to know me better, you'll find brevity is maybe not the greatest of my virtues, but I'll try. If moving really quickly over a half century or so of historical events. The regime of race segregation in especially the Old South, the Old Confederacy, begins construction late 1880s, early 1890s. Supreme Court ratifies that in Plessy versus Ferguson, and then commences kind of a muted and low-level, for the most part, civil rights battle that starts to get louder in the World War II era. I mean, the beginnings of what became the Freedom Rides are in the 1940s, and the legal preparation for Brown versus Board takes place in starts in the late 1930s. The moment that a lot of people, reasonably enough, associate with the commencement of the civil rights movement in its activist phase, when Rosa Parks decides to take an act of disobedience on a bus in December of 1955. Interesting little part of that story is that this happens in Montgomery, where young Martin Luther King Jr. is a new pastor, and it's a women's organization that begins that protest that turns into the Montgomery bus boycott, which turns into Martin Luther King Jr.'s first triumph, and that's really his entrance onto the national stage. He becomes famous. What follows from that? Let's see, in 1960, the students kind of spontaneously in the beginning start a sit-in movement in lunch counters in North Carolina. That spreads all over the South. Then the Freedom Rides in 1961 were attempts to make good on an Interstate Commerce Commission desegregation regulation. So they were testing that in bus terminals. So they organized bus travels from DC, Washington, DC to Birmingham across the South, quite a bit of violence and some publicity. And then King's failure, which isn't really King's failure, but we can tell that story later, in Albany, and that sets up the campaign in Birmingham. Success in Birmingham, then we go on to the March, and then we get really serious civil rights legislation.
Excellent, thank you. And that was brief, so okay. Thanks for that overview. And what can you tell us a little bit more about this Albany movement? Because you've mentioned that King sort of had a failure, or at least didn't achieve his objectives. And so, what led to that failure?
Yeah, King came to regret his involvement in Albany. And actually, the Albany movement wasn't planned by King. The Albany movement was a campaign initiated by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, as commonly known, which was, as the name implies, a gathering of students that really grew out of the sit-ins of 1960 and the Freedom Rides. So SNCC gets organized. Its first president is John Lewis. SNCC gets organized, and in the fall of 1961, this is a kind of an extension of the Freedom Rides. A couple of students in Atlanta decide that we're going to go to Albany. There's a historically black college there, and we're going to desegregate, or make sure at least of the desegregation of the bus terminal in Albany. So that's how it gets started. And so that's one of the goals. But one of the things King complained about was that he thought the goals were a bit scattered. So they formed this Albany movement. The NAACP, local chapter of the NAACP, gets involved. A couple of local business figures, black business figures, get involved as leaders of the Albany movement. And doing all this, so they organize demonstrations at the bus terminal. They run into a very clever adversary And the clever adversary is the sheriff of Albany, a man named Laurie Pritchett. He had studied the civil rights movement, and so he had studied the way in which it succeeds and the way in which it fails. And he came to the conclusion that, to put it very briefly, when it gets a lot of publicity, it succeeds. When it attracts national publicity. And the way it attracts national publicity, this is of course a sadly familiar story for us, is by disseminating images of police brutality. And so that's the thing we want to avoid. And so Pritchett, I don't know, Pritchett said, yes, he would say things publicly like, yes, I'm a convert to nonviolence. Which wasn't exactly true, but he kept the violence off camera. He also makes sure from surrounding counties that he's got enough jail space to put demonstrators in jail. So they never succeed in overwhelming the jail system. And city officials refuse to negotiate, and it comes more or less to a standstill. And then King gets asked to, one of the local business leaders was a friend of King, leaders of the Albany movement, and asks King to intervene. And so King says, okay. And his thinking is, I'm going to come to Albany, I'm going to give a speech, and then I'm going to be on my way. And they ask him to lead a march, so I'm spending a night in jail. But nothing really comes of this. And this is a long enough story already, I won't go on and on about it. Nothing comes of it then. This is now December 1961. King goes away, King gets invited back the next summer, still nothing really comes of it. The media coverage is to the effect that Albany's a big failure and an embarrassment for Martin Luther King. And then following that, later 1962, from King's point of view, the civil rights movement is at a kind of a crossroads. His organization is pretty much out of money, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. His own leadership of the movement is in question because the younger activists are kind of superseding him and are actually quite irritated with him. We can talk about that if you want. And so King thinks this is kind of a moment of crisis after Albany.
Okay,
that's that's the lead into the Birmingham campaign.
Yeah, well, it certainly is. And so, why does King and why do the movement leaders shift their efforts over to Birmingham? Why do they select Birmingham to hold civil rights demonstrations?
Well, King called Birmingham the citadel of Southern segregation. Birmingham was known among the civil rights movement leadership and activists as Birmingham, colloquially. It was a violent place to be involved in the civil rights cause. Birmingham had a relatively large population of African Americans, a little under 40%. And that meant that Birmingham had a tighter regime of segregation than some other cities did. This is a part of the history of race relations in the U.S. that much of it is an important factor. Let's put it this way: is demographics. You know, that the larger the concentration of a Black population, the more worried and the more sometimes repressive the white population becomes. That was true in Birmingham. So Birmingham has this reputation of, so to speak, the capital of segregation. King, as I say, is worried about the movement running aground. And so Birmingham is chosen, if we want to use a sports metaphor, as kind of a Hail Mary. I mean, Birmingham is going for broke. And the idea is, if we can pull this off, you know, then we can really turn things around. And so that's why Birmingham is chosen. But Birmingham is chosen with a good bit of trepidation, because they were they were well prepared for the eventuality that they were going to face violence, and some of them might not come out of it alive.
Wow. All right, interesting. And can you tell us about some of the course of events at Birmingham? How do things start, and where do they go?
Let me say, yeah. I mean, in kind of transition to answering that, let me say one further thing. I just painted a very grim picture of Birmingham. I think everything, as far as I know, everything I said is true. But there's one further thing, I guess, that's worth noting about the choice of Birmingham. There's some indication that change might be afoot. There's a mayoral election. The mayoral election pits two defenders of segregation against one another, but one of them is moderate and reasonable, and the other one is not. The other one is really hardline. The other one is the now infamous Eugene Bull Connor. And there's a real chance, the locals think, that the Bull Connor regime might be removed from office, and that there might be a new day in Birmingham. And so I don't know if I want to call it a coalition, but there's some sharing of opinion on the part of relatively moderate whites, uncomfortable with segregation, uncomfortable with the kind of reputation that it gives the city, and black leadership who think that maybe we can actually get something done in a way that we were going to be unable to do that before. Okay, so let's touch on a few highlights in the chain of events in the Birmingham campaign. We should credit the local minister, who's the SCLC activist member, who's been an agitator for equal rights for a long time, is a guy named Fred Shuttlesworth. And so Shuttlesworth wants to organize a campaign, a jobs and desegregation kind of campaign in Birmingham. And Shuttlesworth wants the involvement of the network, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, along with King. And so Shuttlesworth and the others decide to plan this campaign. And so King is trying to learn his lessons from Albany. So they're trying to be very deliberate. So they spend the winter months, 1962, early 1963, planning. Then comes this mayoral election that I alluded to in April of 63. Some of the locals are saying, please don't do any direct action demonstrations before this mayor's election, because you're gonna risk a backlash that'll keep Bull Connor in office. You don't want to do that. So King and his colleagues agreed that they would hold off for a while. So the election happens. The result is that Bull Connor gets voted out, but he challenges the result, and so that's really up in the air for the next few months. And King and Shuttlesworth and Ralph Abernathy decide to go ahead with the Birmingham campaign. The campaign itself takes twists and turns. Their initial demonstrations, initial jailings, not a heck of a lot of media influence, media attention. The city, in response, secures a judicial decree, local judicial decree, forbidding any further demonstrations. So King has a decision now: do I want to disobey and go to jail, or do I want to comply with this and fight it in the courts, which is going to take at least months and maybe longer? If King is in jail, then there's a concern that they might not be able to raise any money. They might not have money to bail out people who were able to protest, and that means they might not be able to recruit people, who need to put food on the table for these protests. So it's a bind, but he decides to go ahead with the march to disobey the law. The march takes place symbolically enough, on Good Friday of 1963. So you see Martin Luther King marching to jail as Jesus is marching to his fate, right? And this is the first major act of civil disobedience on King's part in the civil rights era. And a further thing happens. So King goes to jail on Good Friday. That same day, a group of Birmingham clergy, when I teach classes on this subject, I like to call them the Birmingham Eight, a group of Birmingham clergy, they're all whites, they're not segregationists, they're relatively moderate opponents of segregation. They vary ideologically, along the scale. They compose a public letter. The letter gets published on that Good Friday. And King gets wind of it the following day. Somebody shows it to him in prison. And the letter, in effect, is a public letter addressed to King and the protesters: please desist. Your protesters are outsiders. The street protests aren't going to be helpful. There's a very high risk of I don't know if I want to use the word inciting, but eliciting a violent response and unsettling the cause of reform. Please just leave it to us and leave it to legal channels. And that's, according to the legend, that's what prompts King to write the letter from Birmingham Jail. The story, the true story, is a little more complicated than that. I mean, they've been wanting a civil rights manifesto for a long time. They talked about writing a letter from jail. This is, of course, modeled on St. Paul's letters. They talked about writing it for some time. They talked about writing one in the Albany campaign, but that didn't work out well. So they were looking for an occasion, and this is what presented itself. King writes the letter, which now is world famous and anthologized in a million different places. It really didn't have that much effect right away. It didn't appear in print right away. King was in jail 8 days. He gets out. That's long before the letter sees the light of day. So the letter doesn't turn events, really. Somebody comes up with the idea. What we need are more protesters. Let's enlist people's children. And so they stage, and there's big controversy about this, lots of misgivings about this among Black residents of Birmingham. But they decide to go ahead with it. So they have the Children's March. And the Children's March infuriates Bull Connor. The Children's March is met with, I say children, some of them are quite young, but these are high school kids mostly, right? Who are charged up about this whole cause and are willing to go to jail. And this infuriates the police commissioner, Connor, who unleashes the dogs that everybody has seen on film footage now. That does attract tremendous national attention pretty much instantly. That gets the Kennedy administration involved, putting pressure on the locals to negotiate. It makes the local business leaders very uneasy about all of this. And so fairly quickly after that, a desegregation settlement is reached, and it's a gigantic media victory for the protesters. So there's Birmingham in a few minutes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the images of not only the police dogs, but the fire hoses being thrown on people, the beatings that are taking place. I mean, really, really horrific stuff. And they're going a little bit, maybe taking a little deeper dive into this letter from Birmingham Jail. Can you tell us just a little bit more about that? There's a copy in this resource, and it really describes, I think, the pathos of segregation. He really describes its horrors very movingly. Also, a lot of natural law, distinguishing between just and unjust laws, and also some appeal to not only American principles, but sort of Western ideals writ large.
the Birmingham Eight, the clergy to whom he's proximately responding, had a good claim in a way to be moderates, middle of the roaders, and it's an important part of the story because they charged King with being an extremist. So I'll come back to that point in a second. A little further word about context to set this up. I ask students when I'm talking about this, and sometimes in teacher seminars, okay, who's the governor of Alabama at this time? And the answer is relatively newly elected George Wallace. And so George Wallace gives in his inaugural governor's address on January of 1863, the famous segregation today, so segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech. And he invokes Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and so forth. So, Wallace says, look, I want to fight the Civil War again against these civil rights campaigners. And he gets elected on that platform. In response to that, this same group of Birmingham clergy wrote a public letter with the same title. The letter to King was called An Appeal to Law and Order and Common Sense. The first letter that they wrote, which was called An Appeal to Law and Order and Common Sense, was not addressed by name, but everybody knew it was addressed to the governor. And the gist of the letter was the appeal to law and order meant the law and order in question was Brown versus Board. Stop resisting the desegregation decision. This is now constitutional law of the land, and obey the law, and let's do this in a moderate reformist kind of way. So they rebuked Governor Wallace first, and then they rebuked the street protesters led by King later. And so they're gradualists. They're gradual reformists, and they called on that basis. I mean, they're saying, in effect, we're the true moderates, and King and Wallace are the extremists on both sides of us. And that charge on King, he says, I can't quote it from memory exactly, but he says in effect this: I don't respond to criticism very often. I'm Martin Luther King Jr. I get a lot of correspondence, and a lot of it's unfriendly. And I don't respond to it because if I did, that's all I would do is respond to the mail I get. And that leads you to think, okay, so King doesn't respond to critical correspondence, but he does here. And so why? So that means King must think there's something kind of special about this letter that really demands a response. Now, I said, before, they're looking for an occasion, but I think what's special about it is this claim to moderation, and the fact that they're clergy. They're 7 Christians of various denominations and 1 rabbi, and so they're men of God, and these are exactly the people that King wants to communicate with. I mean, King isn't going to talk Bull Connor out of his pro-segregation position, but there are plenty of people in the South who might be receptive to the right kind of appeals. So this is why he takes 2 positions in response to this charge of extremism. I mean, if you wanted to rebut that just in general terms, you could say either of 2 things. You could say, no, I'm not an extremist. Or you could say, yes, I am, but it's okay to be an extremist. And King kind of says both those things in the letter. But the claim to moderation, I think, is the one that we ought to focus on here the most. That's a kind of long-winded introduction to the response to your question about the natural law. But I think it's very important for King to locate the movement in the mainstream American tradition of thinking about justice. I think that King understood that it was a dictate of wisdom not to allow the civil rights movement to degenerate into anti-Americanism. The abolitionists, 100 years before that, had just the same sort of tension that they had to work through. King is in a similar kind of position, so he's taking great pains in the letter to demonstrate a kind of wholehearted fidelity to the first principles of the American regime, and it serves its purpose well enough. I mean, I think when King talks about natural law, he mentions the Declaration and goes beyond it. He talks about St. Thomas Aquinas too. He talks about a whole long, briefly, but he talks about a whole long Western tradition, natural law thinking. But the heart of it, I think, for him is the Declaration of Independence, and he has a good way of applying it to the campaign in Birmingham. That the fundamental principle of the American political and constitutional order is equality of rights, equality in natural human rights. And that means that just government has to be by the consent of the governed. And those two things mean that any political order that segregates people, that disfranchises them, simply on the basis of their color, has to be understood as a violation of natural rights. And a further thing. So what do you do about that? And King says a remarkable thing here in the context of explaining his and defending his act of civil disobedience, of disobeying the law. King says, what we're doing here is expressing the highest respect for law. He says that there's a prudential consideration in that, but there's also a principled argument in that, I think. The protesters, on the one hand, really had to show themselves in a demonstrative way as being a law-abiding people, not anarchists, not people interested in chaos or anything like that. They had to show themselves as basically lawful citizens. And the argument is that the natural rights principles imply that just government has to be by rule of law, meaning not only that people who are citizens are subject to the law, but the people who make and enforce the laws have to be subject to law also. Those people, public officials, have to be subject to a higher law. That higher law, the highest of those higher laws, is the law of nature. And then the constitutional law is supposed to be a kind of specification of the law of nature. What happens when government transgresses those limits? Well, people have the right to judge the transgression, to petition government to redress it. They have the right to vote governors out of office. And if they're denied those things, then they have the right to disobey. I mean, if the transgressions are sufficiently serious and chronic, they have the right to disobey. And disobedience must be civil if possible, and maybe non-civil if necessary. So that's my summation of his argument, and he says further things to substantiate it. But along the way, he's mentioning Socrates, and he's mentioning St. Augustine, and he's mentioning Thomas Aquinas, and he's mentioning Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson. He's putting himself in the mainstream of American thinking about justice.
Right, and really trying to explore why he thinks that an unjust law is no law at all, right?
Yeah.
And really examining why it's sociologically, politically, economically sinful and wrong. This idea of segregation, this segregation regime. Next slide. All right, and so what effects do these events have in Birmingham on the American conscience? How does television and media help to help to shape that understanding, especially for those who aren't living under, Jim Crow and stuff.
It's an interesting question whether Martin Luther King Jr. could have been Martin Luther King Jr., could have been successful in the way that he was before the advent of television.
Right.
I think there is a certain, I don't know that this is exclusive to King, but there's a certain genius about staging protests and putting oneself in the position of martyrdom. In maybe varying degrees. That's very powerful when people see it. A really general consideration might be to say that I think one of the big things that King understood is that great leadership has to be an appeal to a combination of the head and the heart. You're not going to just reason people out of segregation. There are many people who are not people of ill will racially, who thought that the aftermath of these direct action protests is often violence and disorder, so there's this powerful current of opinion. But when you're shown these pictures, of especially dogs biting fierce dogs, biting teenage kids, cops beating people, then that has an effect, and it certainly had an effect on the Kennedy administration, which was, in a cautious sort of way, friendly to the civil rights cause, but very, very worried about losing Democrat votes in the southern states. And so, they didn't like the direct action because for political reasons, I think mainly, they were very worried about it. But opinion turned, and the Kennedy administration became quickly much more energetic in pursuing civil rights legislation in the aftermath of Birmingham.
Okay, and how does the movement generally build on these successes in Birmingham to then, because another event that summer, later on that summer, is obviously the March on Washington. So how does that lead us, and tell us a little bit about that march?
Yeah, King called his method direct action, nonviolent direct action, and he meant by that, essentially, let's appeal to public opinion rather than going through the courts. But there's a sense in which, all that we've described up to this point is really kind of indirect action, because what you're trying to do is, you're attracting media coverage, and that's going to arouse northern public opinion mainly. And that's going to stir the Kennedy administration or the federal government into action, and that's going to move the state government into action. So it's all relatively indirect. After Birmingham, I think King decides, let's make it really direct. Let's go straight to Washington. And so they start planning right away. King wants to do this. Others leaders of other civil rights organizations are, some of them enthusiastic. Of course, the younger people at SNCC are going to be enthusiastic. The NAACP is a little more cautious. The Urban League apparently initially is a little more cautious, but King is all on board with this publicly, and so they all get on board really pretty quickly. The March on Washington, it was an idea that had been around for a couple of decades, and the real initiator of the idea is A. Philip Randolph, a veteran labor leader who initially planned one and was going to go through with it as a way of pressuring the Franklin Roosevelt administration. And Roosevelt conceded enough at the last minute. Roosevelt was like Kennedy. He thought the potential for embarrassment or worse was very high, and so he didn't want any part of this march. And so Roosevelt made concessions, some march came off, but Randolph had still entertained a hopefulness about conducting such a march in D.C. And so it finally comes about, and he too is one of the big organizers of it. This was a really quite extraordinary thing, the March on Washington. The figure that is commonly mentioned is 250,000 people gathered for this march. And it came out, and the Kennedy administration is very worried about the obvious things you would worry about, about an outbreak of violence. And it came off very peacefully. And it was, by and large, very well organized, for which Bayard Rustin, another of the civil rights activist leaders, deserves a good bit of credit. But when we talk about this, I'm not going to editorialize, but when we talk about this in the present day, a gathering of 250,000 people in the aftermath of a victory, yes, but a victory that contained visible outrages in Birmingham and a really dramatic outrage in the Medgar Evers killing. And it came off totally peacefully. That's got to seem a remarkable thing.
And of course, there were many other speakers that day, but we remember the King's speech, and it really is a seminal speech in American history. And again, like we did with the letter from Birmingham Jail, maybe if you can discuss a little bit about some of the constitutional American principles in there. And he does something very interesting rhetorically, right? He calls the Declaration of Independence a promissory note, right? Jefferson had called it a self-evident truth.
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln, because of the contested nature of the idea in the Civil War, called it, a proposition that all men are created equal.
Yeah.
Now King calls it a promissory note. It's really interesting changes over time. So maybe you can allude to that.
That's all very interesting, isn't it? Jefferson wanted to call it sacred and undeniable truth.
Okay, right.
And I'm pretty sure, I got to look this up, you are a superior historian to me, so you may already know this. I'm pretty sure the Congress put the self-evident truth in it, in revision. But anyway, Lincoln calls it a proposition. Dedicated at Gettysburg, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln explains a bit more elaborately what he means by that in his speech on the Dred Scott decision, where Lincoln says that the authors of the Declaration knew very well that not everybody's rights were secure at this moment, but they envisioned these principles as spreading and deepening their influence. And he says very pointedly that they meant those principles in a colorblind way, to benefit, he says, all men of all colors, or all people, I think, of all colors everywhere. And in that respect, I think King's reading of the Declaration is pretty much entirely in accord with Lincoln's. King was very much inspired by the example of Lincoln. He had Lincoln on his mind a lot, and that persisted through at least the early and the most successful part of his adult career. The year 1963, as you suggested, is itself significant here. The year 1963 is the 100-year anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, but it's more fundamentally the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Frederick Douglass, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, in a fit of enthusiasm said, henceforward, this day, January the 1st, is going to replace July the 4th in the minds and hearts of the American people. This is Lincoln's new birth of freedom, right? This is the rebirth of the country. This is when America becomes itself. That, of course, didn't happen. King is thinking along his lines, I think, when he says 50 years ago, he wants people to think this is, look, I want to remind you of what happened in 1863. 1863 was emancipation. We're supposed to be emancipated, but we're not fully emancipated. Back to Lincoln, King tried to persuade JFK to issue a kind of updated Emancipation Proclamation. There was an executive order, mandating non-discriminatory hiring and things like that. And of course, he didn't persuade JFK to do that. And then when he's crafting this speech that becomes the "I Have a Dream" speech, he's quite self-consciously thinking about the Gettysburg Address, and he's trying to come up with words that might be worthy, that might make his speech worthy of being a successor to the Gettysburg Address. And of course, the event culminates at the Lincoln Memorial. So Lincoln is all over the place in the March on Washington in King's imagination, and beyond that, same idea that you just alluded to. The Declaration and the Constitution, he says, he honors the founders and he honors Lincoln, that this is the soul of the country. This is the great promise of America, is a fully integrated republic, integrated across lines of color and creed and so forth. And this is what we're here to make good on, that we are, in a sense, we're not anti-American. We're not coming here in a spirit of opposition. We're trying to channel the true spirit of America. We're the true sons and daughters of the founders here. And so it's a grand kind of patriotic appeal as well as a reformist appeal.
Okay, excellent. And how do these nonviolent demonstrations, this rhetoric of King and others, how do these successes of the civil rights movement, how does what King calls the fierce urgency of now, how does that then lead to the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act?
Okay, that's
in a nutshell.
Oh yeah, I mean that could be kind of a quick and easy question, or it could be a really big and complicated question. We don't have time for all the bigness and the complications, but you would like to be able to say that the March on Washington is the coming of the civil rights movement to a kind of grand crescendo, and then after that, it was just quick and easy and inevitable that you got the Civil Rights Act passed, and then the following year, the Voting Rights Act. But it didn't really happen that way. The way we remember King's dream speech is, professors of rhetoric or public opinion polls say this is the greatest speech of the 20th century by an American and so forth. But that really isn't the way it was received. It's not that it was received in a hostile way. It was received with praise, but then relatively quickly forgotten. And it didn't become a great big thing again, sad to say, until after King was murdered. And then the retrospectives on his life started unearthing this speech, and that became his most enduring words. So it didn't move the Congress instantly. I mean, the JFK administration had composed a civil rights bill in the summer of 1963. That bill was now kicking around Congress, and it had a lot of resistance from the quarters you would expect in the Congress, and its prospects were really quite uncertain. And they weren't really much more certain, from what I understand anyway. They really weren't much more certain after the march, after King's dream speech. On the timeline of events, You know, again, you'd like to say that this is kind of the great triumph, and okay, now everything's nice in the civil rights field. Well, hardly more than 2 weeks after the speech, the day of the March on Washington, that speech was given August 28th. A couple weeks after the 16th Street bombing, church bombing in Birmingham, in which 4 young girls, you know, going to Sunday school, yeah, 4 of them got killed and 1 of them was permanently blinded. You know, this is horrible, horrible crime. It isn't that all the civil rights problems got solved, you know, by these demonstrations. There's still a great deal of resistance, and so I think you have to say, as a matter of explaining the progress of historical events, the assassination of Kennedy is what created a great deal of momentum for the passage of the civil rights law. So it was to honor the martyred president by enacting the legislative program that he was pushing for. You know, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act don't get passed in the same year. The Voting Rights Act comes in 1965 in the summer. And you would think that Lyndon Johnson would have been gung-ho about the Voting Rights Act. He was in favor of it, but he had other things he wanted to do first. And so they organized another march, the Selma to Montgomery March, and that is met with outrage, first of all, that attracts national attention. And it's after that, and that again turned public opinion very strongly in support of the voting rights measure. And so that's what that sets the bill at the front of the Johnson administration agenda. And so that gets passed in the late summer of 1965. So, you know, Birmingham and the March and these kinds of events did a lot, but they didn't do everything to get these laws passed. Those are probably the 2 most important pieces of civil rights legislation in U.S. history, the Voting Rights Act especially. But they were a great struggle.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Pete, for your time. And again, thank you for your contribution to the Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness textbook. This topic is certainly in not only this textbook, but also many other BRI materials, including American Portraits, our Heroes and Villains curriculum, and in the forthcoming Liberty and Justice for All. So again, thank you for coming on and talking with us about your essays.
It's been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure.